The battle for the throne of the Achaemenid Empire had concluded. Artaxerxes had prevailed against his brother Cyrus, thereby firmly establishing his rule. But the battlefield hadn't cleared up yet. Most of Cyrus' forces, after his death, had either routed or sworn themselves to the king, the exception being the 10,000 Greek mercenaries. The Greeks were still oblivious to Cyrus' death. They decided, after defeating the Persian left wing, to make their way back to what they thought would be a victorious Cyrus. On their way back, they were surprised by Xenophon, who commenced a counter-attack with the king's forces, nearly enveloping them, though this proved unsuccessful, because again the Greeks charged and found the Persian line melting away in front of them. As this eventful day came to a close, the Greeks decided to look for a good defensible position to make camp. There was a hill nearby which seemed ideal. While approaching, their scouts reported that some of the king's personal cavalry had stationed themselves on the hill. The Greeks formed in a long line along the incline of the hill and slowly moved up, trying to push the horsemen from their outpost. To their surprise, the king's detachment, on seeing the Greeks advance up the mountain, left their position. Having dealt with this, and being absolutely exhausted, they settled in for the night. The break of dawn brought terrible news. The prince had died. This meant that, first, there would be no reward for their struggle, and secondly, they were in mortal danger. Here was a group of hostile foreigners from the fringes of the empire, highly trained and equipped, and only a stone's throw away from the capital of the Achaemenids. Understandably, the Hellenes were unsure what would happen next. After some time, a Greek diplomat in the service of the king arrived to inform them of his demands. They were to give up their weapons and hope for mercy. Before any of the Greek commanders could respond, a young Athenian soldier that had listened in responded in a manner reminiscent of King Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae. He shouted, "Come and take them." Another of the rank and file replied, "Our weapons are all that remains, and our courage. But how else can we use our courage than with our weapons?" Finally, the commanders quieted their men and proceeded with the negotiations. Proxenus, the Theban, answered the diplomat with, "The victors usually don't give up their weapons to the vanquished." Quick side note, Proxenus was a friend of Xenophon and invited him to join the expedition to serve as the historian. Initially, Clearchus was so upset by the mere suggestion of giving up their weapons that he wouldn't even respond. But after Proxenus had answered, he added something along the line of, "The king must know that this command is unacceptable to us." Having heard all this, the diplomat extended one last warning to not leave their location, as this would be perceived as a declaration of war by the Persians, and then left to report back. Afterwards, the Greeks also received a message from Ariaeus, who had gathered the surviving Ionian Greeks and invited them to march back to Anatolia. This seemed feasible to the Greeks, who at this point just wanted to get back to their homeland. After arriving at the agreed-upon meeting point, the two contingents made their way up the Euphrates. The Persians were still in deliberations as how exactly to proceed, when suddenly they heard reports of the combined army of Greeks and Ionians close by. In the attempt to make their way back, taking the same route as before, the combined army stumbled upon the king's camp. The Persians, alarmed and unsure as to the Greeks' intentions, suddenly chose a very different tone. None other than Xenophon was dispatched with generous peace terms. Since Xenophon had retaken control of Cyrus' provinces, he reintegrated Ariaeus' contingent to resume their service as imperial troops under his command. Under the terms of this agreement, the king offered the Greeks provisioning and safe passage back to their respective territories, with the condition that they would follow Tissaphernes and abstain from looting any of the territory that they would be traversing. Unbeknownst to the Greeks, this peace agreement was a trap to dispose of them. The king had previously consulted with some of his generals and satraps, addressing issues facing his domain. One pressing matter was that of the Greek mercenaries. There were some ideas as how to manage this situation. Tissaphernes eventually came up with a suitable solution. Rather than attack them outrightly, he wanted to lead them along a difficult way back, and during the journey, slowly and with trickery, destroy or at least deplete them sufficiently. He had two options to lead the Greeks back and put his plan into action. They could return the way they had arrived, or there was the path north along the Tigris, crossing several mountain chains with the eventual destination of Trapezus. He wasn't keen to see the Greeks march back through his territories in Anatolia, so he suggested to the king to take them the route north. He argued that winter was approaching quickly, and the Greeks would surely not be able to survive crossing the mountains in those harsh weather conditions. Additionally, there were hostile mountain tribes that would attack them. Because of their lack of knowledge of the terrain, the Greeks would likely splinter into ever smaller groups, making themselves easy targets for the tribes or even the Persians to wipe out. The Greeks, left with little alternative, agreed and joined Tissaphernes and his men towards their first destination, the city of Sittak. Tissaphernes had his men keep a close eye on the Greeks. He was, so it seemed, going out of his way to provoke them. This fueled the Greeks' distrust and animosity towards their supposed benefactors. This state of hostility continued as they marched north along the Tigris and parallel the Zagros mountains. Osthenes, another of Darius' sons, and Artaxerxes and Cyrus' younger brother, had gathered an army from Susa and Ecbatana and moved west towards the Tigris. Understandably, the news of this army close by made the Greeks nervous, and so Clearchus, in an effort to discourage Osthenes from attacking, decided to stretch out the marching column as long as possible, making it seem as though their force was larger than expected. Although Osthenes was not keen on fighting this Greek army, most likely he was positioning his men to block key mountain passes in an effort to protect his territory and the wealthy cities therein. One interesting side note is that Osthenes would in time become grandfather to Darius III, the Achaemenid king that would oppose Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire. At Larissa, a town close to Nineveh, one of the ancient capitals of Assyria, the Persians finally decided to resume hostilities. The Hellenes had for a considerable time felt monitored by the Persians. Many started getting paranoid about being betrayed and attacked by the Persians. Ironically, the Greek commanders under the leadership of Clearchus were invited by the Persians to discuss the situation and find if there might be anyone in the army of either side at fault. Arriving at the Persian camp, the Greek commanders were escorted to Tissaphernes' tent and on entry immediately arrested. Meanwhile, the accompanying sub-commanders and servants that had waited at the camp were swiftly killed by Persian horsemen. Only one of the servants managed to make it back to the Greek camp to inform his countrymen, after which he died from his wounds. The Greek generals were subsequently brought to the king and executed. The Persians for now left the area and waited for an opportune time to harass the Greeks. After a few days of being unsure of how to continue, just waiting for any kind of development, the Hellenes decided to vote for new leaders. 5 commanders were chosen to lead the army: Timasion, Xanthocles, Cleonor, Philisius, and last but not least, Xenophon. There's not just a change in personnel, but also in the manner of leadership. Following this transition, there was less of a Spartan monarchical leadership, which we saw with Clearchus, and more of an Athenian-style, democratic, vote and meeting-based system. Keep in mind that these meetings were only accessible for those hand-picked aristocratic generals and some advisors. The following weeks were extremely challenging for the Greeks. The Persians continued to harass them. Being more mobile with their cavalry, they used quick hit-and-run tactics to slowly deplete the foreigners' forces. Another challenge for the Greeks was that many of the villages along the way got evacuated and even burned, making provisioning tough. The terrain presented itself exceedingly grueling, having to traverse the many tributaries of the Tigris and the uphill climb of the Zagros mountains. Finally, the weather conditions worsened as winter was approaching. In a cruel twist, just some months ago, these men had thrown away any excess clothing to survive the extreme heat, which now would have come in handy. While crossing the mountains into the Armenian satrapy, the Hellenes organized the marching column in a way that would protect them from Persian re-attacks, for example while crossing a bridge or any kind of choke point, although at some point the Persians did stop tailing the Greeks. The next threat presented itself in form of the Carducci. This mountain tribe was never formally integrated by the Persians, and passing through their territory was usually possible only by paying the Carducci a toll. They attacked the Greeks from the flanks, throwing projectiles from above. They also blocked narrow passes, rolling down stones to crush anyone that would approach. Making it past these attacks required the Greeks' ingenuity. At some point midwinter, they passed the mountains and encountered a tributary river of the Euphrates that marked the border of Armenia. This was the last big hurdle to overcome to reach Trapezus, a Greek colony by the Black Sea, that opened the way back to Greece proper. The Greeks were elated. They made camp and prepared to cross by dawn of the following day. The morning dampened their mood. A detachment that was supposed to secure the crossing point over the river reported back with the news of a sizable army blocking the crossing point. Additionally, the Carducci had sent their men down the mountains to attack from the rear at an opportune time. They seemed to be caught between a rock and a hard place. Making things even worse was that their provisions ran low, so they had to act quickly. Naturally, they called a council of commanders, comparing ideas on how to escape this situation. During this debate, they received reports of a second unguarded crossing point west of their position. After some deliberation, Xenophon came up with a plan, which the commanders agreed upon. The Greeks break camp and start marching towards the second river crossing, all the while being shadowed by the Armenians on the other side. As they start to slowly cross the river, their advance is halted as the vanguard is confronted on the bank of the river by the Armenians. At the same time, the Carducci sensed the opportunity to attack the bottled up rear of the Greek column. Xenophon now takes his detachment and makes a run for the first river crossing, which was left undefended. Reaching it just in time, he pretends to start crossing the river to lure in the Carducci. This deception succeeds, making the Carducci quickly advance from the rear in order to catch the fleeing Greeks. In the last moment, before they charge, Xenophon gives an order for the entire Greek line to turn around and go into battle formation. Xenophon had previously instructed the missile units to wait for this moment to commence a flanking maneuver. The plan succeeds, and the surprised tribesmen, attacked from two sides and not used to fighting disciplined heavy infantry, completely rout. Although exhausted, Xenophon gathers his men to cross the river and attack the Armenians' exposed flank. As word of the approaching second Greek contingent reached the Armenian satrap, Teribasos, he ordered a retreat, fearing being overwhelmed by the Greeks. Finally, the entire army safely crosses the river. In the aftermath of this battle, Teribasos offered the Greeks safe passage through his territory. In exchange, they agreed not to plunder his lands. For the final part of their journey, the Hellenes made their way through the Armenian satrapy. Although they passed on peaceful terms, local militias attacked them along the way, after which they traveled through the eastern Black Sea mountains. Xenophon describes what happened as they were approaching the Black Sea. He found himself leading the rear guard, following the other detachments, up a very steep pass. They were in the process of climbing the summit of a mountain. Suddenly, he heard shouting from the men in front, steadily growing closer as they were approaching the summit. His first thought was that there was an enemy army waiting for them on the other side. He mounted his horse and rode as quickly as he could to investigate. At reaching the brink of the pass, he finally understood the men shouting. The soldiers were joyfully screaming, "Thalata, Thalata! The sea, the sea!" Finally, the Greeks had reached something very close to all of them, the sea, the same waters that connected them to Greece. Upon reaching the port city of Ephesus, the army split in two. While the older and wounded soldiers journeyed via ship, the rest of the army used the path along the coast to reach their home territories. The accounts and stories of these soldiers drastically change the Greek perspective of the Achaemenid Empire. They inspire the next generation of young, aristocratic Greeks and Macedonians to dream of their own adventures in the Far East.